Hey, I hope you're doing well. This week, as we continue in our series through Samuel, the Quest for the King, we're looking at 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10. So if you've got a Bible and you want to open it up and read that, 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10. One tip is that if you don't want to read it, but you still want to listen to it, you can, in the ESV Bible app, you can play, there's a play button and it'll read it to you, or you can use the app, I really like it, Bible.is, and they have a bunch of dramatized, they're kind of cheesy versions, but some of them are really good too, dramatized audio versions of the Bible, and you can listen on there and have it read to you as you walk or do whatever else you need to do. But yeah, 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10. So pause the video now and read that if you can. And then we'll jump in. So assuming that you've actually read it, hopefully you have, it's a really good story. This story immediately reminds me the character of Saul that we're going to be introduced to. It reminds me of Lance Armstrong. When I was growing up, Lance Armstrong was huge. He's, if you don't know, he's a cyclist. He won the Tour de France 7 times. And he grew up as this kid from small town America. He was on the Olympic team when he was in high school. Almost didn't graduate from high school because he was so focused on cycling. While he was on the Olympic team, he was good, but he wasn't that great. And he became a professional cyclist in his 20s, but was kind of middle of the pack, never the greatest cyclist in the world. And then at 25, he got diagnosed with cancer. And it was stage 3, and it had spread all throughout his body. It was in his lungs and everything, and he was really falling apart physically. And so he started chemo and radiation and had only like a 50% chance of survival even. And he had this miraculous recovery, put it in remission, and was healed from cancer. But then the question was, is this guy ever going to be able to bike again? You know, he'd only, at this point in his career, only been a kind of middle-of-the-road cyclist anyways. And so he gets back on the bike and he starts training, and he shows up and makes it to the Tour de France, the biggest event in cycling. He makes it there for that summer and comes out and is doing really well, and everyone's surprised. And there's this one really big hill climb, and a couple of like the leaders kind of break away from the front of the pack, and he catches up, and they're like, who is this guy? He's just out of cancer. Like, he's never really been the greatest, and who does he think he is? And he keeps climbing and climbing and climbing, and he pushes past them and makes it to the top of the mountain in this famous finish. And that really propelled him to the lead to win the Tour de France that year, even though he had just returned from having cancer. And he went on to win 6 more, so I think a total of 7. So when I was growing up, he was a huge sports star, like one of the biggest. And while doing that, he started this really cool nonprofit called Livestrong. Maybe you remember the bracelets. They were these yellow silicone bracelets that were like $1 a piece, and they sold 80 million of them to raise money for cancer research. And so really this like all-around world-class guy, until they found out a couple years later that he had been using performance-enhancing drugs the whole time. It turns out this wonderful story of this hero who had cancer and came back even stronger, this great American cyclist who had won the Tour de France 7 times, this philanthropist who had raised all this money for cancer. It turns out that he had been a cheater the whole time. The hero that they saw in front of them was not what he turned out to be. As we look at this story this week, from 1 Samuel, I can't help but thinking the same thing. We're kind of still in the beginning of the story, right? We're going to learn about Saul and how he's chosen to be the king, all this crazy stuff that's going on. And I think if we just read this passage by itself, we would just see the young Lance Armstrong, just see the one who's won the Tour de France against all odds. But if you know the story, you know he's not going to turn out to be a good guy. You'll have to stick with us in the coming weeks to see exactly how. But he's sort of this Lance Armstrong character. You love him until you realize really kind of who he is. And then you're a little more conflicted about him. So Open up 1 Samuel chapter 9. I'm not going to read all of it, but it's a really great story. And as I said before, you really should read it because there's some really interesting kind of twists and turns. But basically, there's this young guy, Saul. He's really tall. He's really strong. He's everything you expect in like the next king of Israel. So as soon as he comes into the story, you realize this might be a major player. And he's running around looking for these lost donkeys that his dad has lost. And so he's with a servant of his, and they're traveling across the landscape on this quest to find these lost donkeys, something that would have been worth a ton of money. And they look for several days, and they figure, we don't know where the donkeys are. Maybe they've already returned home. Maybe they're already back, and now we need to go back, and maybe my dad's worried about me being lost at this point. And so they're about to turn around, and then his servant's like, hey, you know what? We're really close to this town where there's this old wise man, this prophet, this seer, this man of God, who it turns out is Samuel. And they're really close to this, and they're like, how about we go see him? Because he's pretty cool. And then maybe he'll tell us about the donkeys, and it's worth seeing him anyways. It's kind of like if you've ever been on a road trip and you're like kind of lost, but then you decide, well, what if we turn off? This looks like a pretty cool little roadside attraction. And so they kind of on a last minute, spur of the moment decision decide to go see Samuel. And they show up to see Samuel. And there's this whole, again, I'm not going to relate the whole thing, but it turns out Samuel has been waiting for Saul. Samuel's been told by the Lord, there's going to be this guy that's going to come, and he's going to be the king. He's going to be the one who Israel is going to want as their king. And so Saul just decides to turn off the road to go see Samuel, and just barely catches him in time. And Samuel instead knows, like, this guy's coming. I don't know what his name's going to be, but he's going to be here. And so he has a feast ready for him. He has all these gifts. Like, the whole town has a party waiting on him, and Saul didn't even know it was going to happen. So they show up, and there's this kind of weird little party they have. And then in chapter 10, there's this, and eventually Saul goes home and, tells his dad that the donkeys are found and that he met this weird guy, Samuel. And then in the next chapter, all of Israel gets together, basically, and they cast lots. They basically kind of like rolling dice to see out of all these groups who's going to be the next king. And it turns out that it's Saul. They go from out of all the tribes, they pick a tribe basically with casting lots, and then they pick a clan, a group, and then they pick a family, and then they pick a person in the family, and the lots say like, well, we're not sure. The guy that we're looking for is not here. And then they're like, oh, he's hiding with the baggage. He's with the donkeys. And they go and they find Saul, and they anoint him as king, and they praise him, and they're like, okay, this is going to be the next king of Israel. This is going to be our king. We finally found him. So if you've been following in the story up to this point, you've been waiting for this much of the book for Israel to have a king, for them to be in the promised land and ready to have a king. And they finally got him, and it's Saul. And so that's kind of where the story ends for this week. And again, you should really go and read it because there's a lot of weird twists and turns that I would love to talk with you about. If you get a chance to hop in on our middle school Zoom calls tonight, we can kind of talk about those. But I think the application for us, besides knowing the history of Israel, the relevance for us is that sometimes God will use people who maybe are going to have some serious character flaws to accomplish his purposes. And that God, or in this case Samuel too, knows what's going to happen. We saw last week how he knows the king is not going to be good for Israel, and yet he's still serving God. Sometimes God knows what's going to happen, even though he's lets these bad things seemingly still happen. We talked in Sunday school last week about how Jesus washed Judas's feet, even though he knew Judas was about to betray him. The same thing's true here, right? Samuel's anointing Saul by the will of God, even though he knows Saul is eventually going to be a bad guy. He's going to be like Lance Armstrong. He's going to be a cheater. But for right now, Saul's just the young hero. He's just the one that, if we're reading Samuel for the first time and we get to the Saul story, then we're like, gosh, they finally found the king. What's the rest of the book going to be about? So that's kind of our lesson for this week, is maybe sometimes when we're looking for heroes in our lives, maybe there are sports stars or players or coaches or teams that you're a big fan of, and we look to those as if they could do no wrong. like Lance Armstrong, for a lot of folks when I was growing up. He couldn't do anything wrong. Saul, in this case, he's the tallest in Israel. He's the strongest. They see him and they're like, yes, we want him as our king. Sometimes those folks aren't real. They don't check out, and we don't know what's in their heart. We're going to see in the rest of this book that what's in Saul's heart is not so great, that he's not always going to follow the Lord. And so there's a real warning for us here, especially as people who are really big fans of sports, maybe, or big fans of any humans, that when we look at a person, we can't tell what's in their heart. We don't know whether or not they're really following the Lord. And so there's a warning for us here. When we're going to follow someone, whether as a fan or as a pastor or anything like that, we have to not just judge on what they look like, but judge on the nature of their heart. And so my prayer for us this week would be that we would look to our heroes, look to our Sauls, our Lance Armstrongs, and not just blindly trust them, but instead trust in the Lord. Anyways, that's our lesson for this week. We'll continue in the series next week. If you haven't heard, we're going to be doing Zoom calls as well on Wednesday nights for the guys and girls separately. For now, we're kind of testing that out. So we'd love for you to join. Message us for the links, because unfortunately we can't post the links because there's a lot of trolls who'd like to get on Zoom calls. But we'll see you next week, and have a great week.